also done a lot of computer programming, and you've
Right.
and it seems like after your PhD, you did some work that was more in the technical realm.
Sure.
Now at McMaster, you're in the Communication Studies department, or
Well,
something like that?
it's a department of communication studies and multimedia.
Okay.
So it's a bipolar department. There's lots of cross-fertilization between the two sides of the department, but I'm nominally on the multimedia side of the department.
Okay.
So, there's an undergraduate multimedia program, and really it's based around production, perhaps critically informed production in a range of different media types.
Okay.
So it is fairly technological.
Yeah. Well, I was curious because it's always, to me, seemed an interesting dichotomy between, on the one hand, the sociological or more social research, studies research side of things, more scientific approach, and sort of the more technological approach, which is sort of what the music tech department here is very much focused on. And then there's production, which is a little bit more practice-based, but also a little bit more sort of skill and trade focused.
Yeah.
So you seem like on some level you're kind of well equipped to deal with any number of those.
Yeah, and I don't, since you're asking about career path, I don't think that it was any one thing that set me up to land in this kind of balanced position between these things. It was different things that were going on at the same time. So, my graduate study in composition was all at the University of Toronto, mostly working with Christos Hatzius, but with a few others as well. And while I was doing that, I was also really involved with the Canadian electroacoustic community. In fact, the Canadian electroacoustic community played a significant role in sort of getting me to engage more with electronic music, because years earlier, when I had arrived at the University of Manitoba as a undergraduate in composition, following some previous degrees, there had been a sign on the wall saying, join the CEC and sign up for our email list. And this was 1998, and I can remember signing up for the email list. And at that time, that list was just a constant discussion, people all over the world, and introduced me to all sorts of things that, I had not had the chance to experience until that point. And that was also the same time, the very end of the 90s, where in tandem with this massive expansion of the domestic internet, at least in privileged countries like Canada, you had the free and open source software movement. So there was this kind of perfect storm of learning about the Canadian electroacoustic community, having access to free and open source sound software like C-Sound, and sort of deciding what I wanted to do with my musical career at the same time. So, even though at first electronic music was not sort of a thematic element of my graduate study, it quickly became so. Okay. Yeah.
Do you find that it's in your practice right now, your electroacoustic music is still sort of the foremost? Or, like, where does it fit in terms of your interests?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean by electroacoustic music. So, I've tended to hew to a definition of that you'll often find in the Canadian electroacoustic community as sort of sound through loudspeakers, which is a, rather broad category. So you may be asking about things like acousmatic music or something like that.
No, really, that is kind of what I mean. Just, as opposed to writing for chamber
Oh, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. No, I haven't written a lot for plain chamber ensembles lately. And, I wouldn't rule it out, but it doesn't seem to be something that organically presents itself as I think I just get too busy with other things, and so the things that aren't the most exciting to me don't happen. And I don't know, I can be a bit cheeky about it sometimes. So the thing that I'm directly coming from, being here in Montreal, is the premiere of a piece that I call Sinfonia, which is my first symphony. When you study composition, you're supposed to aspire one day to write symphonies. And when I was younger, of course, I held off writing from a symphony, in that same way that Brahms, I think, didn't want to write his symphony because he was in the shadow of Beethoven and all that. It's like, because your first symphony has to be something serious.
If not, then it's over.
Exactly, yeah. And so that's why I didn't do it now. And then I think later I didn't do it because I'd really gone, completely down the electronic rabbit hole. And so there was just no time to pay attention to it. And now I've written this Sinfonia, but it's a piece for a solo live coding performer, a singer, a percussionist. At least that was the original conception. It's really become tied to the tabla now, and to Shawn's playing, Shawn Mativetsky's playing, and a laptop orchestra. And these things don't have to be in the same space because you can dial them in telematically if you have to. And when we did it a couple of days ago in Birmingham, we did dial them in. So I was on site at the Dome space, the University of Birmingham. My friend and collaborator Kristen Mueller-Heaslip was singing in York's Dispersion Laboratory in Toronto. Shawn Mativetsky was playing tabla just down the hall here in CIRMMT, and the Birmingham Electroacoustic Ensemble Research group, BEER, the laptop orchestra, they were embedded in the audience in the space in Birmingham. And then we did this piece together, which has 4 movements, like a proper symphony should, and in fact is literally based on sort of borrowings from the Brahms symphony. What happens is there's this various types of musical material that I've sort of pulled out of the Brahms 4th Symphony, and that plays in a hidden way, and then what the live coder does is creates transformations that take the material you can't hear and make it manifest to the audience in various ways. But it's all kind of cheeky, and even in performance, there was a few moments where I can't resist but make some jokes in the comments at the expense of the symphony. All in good fun, I hope.
So I guess I'm just going to let the conversation keep rolling, because right away there's a couple of interesting things about that. So one of the things that is one of the key hallmarks of live coding is this idea of projecting code, right? And the idea that people can witness what's going on, and there's some kind of expectation that you may or may not be able to actually understand what's going on because there's syntax, but there's also comments, so you can have informal, show like an informal thought, and the idea of jokes and sort of humor and conversation, it seems to be a really key part of it. So I'm interested in your Sinfonia. You were mentioning that there's elements of the Brahms Symphony playing in the background, so that means that they're not actually being heard. They're just sort of like a running in the background, and then you have to take an action so that people can hear what's going on. When you were programming this, how much were you thinking about how do I make clear to what people who are watching what's happening? What kind of an awareness of trying to visualize the process or display the process is going on?
Yeah, so sharing the screen is really important, I think, for exactly the reason that the 2004 Top Lap Manifesto says, that obscurantism is dangerous, so show us your screens. And I think that line in the manifesto was not just, at least this is how I interpret it, it was not just giving a kind of helpful hint to an emerging live coding movement. I think it was actually responding to what people were seeing in lots of electronic music practices around the turn of the century. I think there was a lot of obscurantism, of people sitting behind laptops in dimly lit rooms. What's going on in that situation? They could be a prop for all the audience knows, right? And I think people have addressed that maybe in different ways, and live coding is only one of them. So anyway, suffice it to say, I think that's really important. And so when I do something like the Sinfonia, I want what I type as a live coding performer to be really strongly salient to the audience. So that means big fonts. That means not ever having to put too much code on the screen at the time. And one of the things I'm happy with in the current manifestation of the Sinfonia is that I can do the whole piece. When we did it a couple of days ago, it was 36 minutes long, and at no point does the sort of active live coding code occupy more than a screen with a really, really big font. So I think that the whole thing is kind of, the text of the whole thing is quite legible. Of course, the way that that is possible is because there's a lot of stuff that is hidden. You know,
Mm-hmm.
making really conscious decisions about what to put on the surface for people, and what to hide. And one of the things that is hidden is the moment-to-moment state of these hidden patterns that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So then the way that the piece is organized overall is basically to highlight different kinds of live coding. So in the first movement, where the sort of famous theme of Brahms, the first movement of Brahms' Fourth Symphony, is fairly close to the surface, fairly audible. From a live coding perspective, it's entirely about synthesis programming. So I've got a pattern that is basically triggering pitches at definite periods in time, and it's a pattern that is really kind of drawn from a modification of that first movement of Brahms' Fourth Symphony. And that all happens behind the scenes, and all I do as the live coding soloist is start from a blank screen and create a synthesizer. You know, and the synthesizer has a name that, you know, has been predetermined to make it respond to that hidden pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just do that one type of programming and try to take it as far as I can in that moment.
Mm.
And I guess that points to something else that is really exciting to me about this kind of work, which is that it's a live coding composition, which may seem like an anachronism at first, and I suppose in some ways it is. But what's exciting about it for me as a live coding performer is I can have this thing that has, in some sense, a predetermined musical structure, and yet, because the structure sort of expects improvisation, for example, it expects you to live code a synthesizer from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
In that first movement, depending on what you're capable of in a given moment, you will take it in different directions. And so, I don't know, that's kind of an interesting model there that sort of balances determinism and predictability with improvisation and virtuosity and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we did it a couple days ago in Birmingham, it was the first time we'd all heard the piece all together, because we'd sort of rehearsed it with different telematic partners at different components. But I really had no idea, you know, what I was going to do in the course of developing the synthesizer in the course of the first movement. And actually I was able to, one of the things I was happy about is that in the hours before that first performance, I was hanging around the venue with Scott Wilson, who I did my doctorate with at U of T, and who I learned a lot from, continued to learn a lot from. And I asked him a super collider question, and he gave me the answer, and I was like, "Oh, that's cool," and I used it in the performance. 2 hours later, you know, I was like, "Okay, that generator that I didn't know about, that's really useful for this. I'm gonna use that," and it influenced the course of what, you know, of the movement, even from its restricted position within the definition of one synthesizer. So first movement, all about synthesis programming, hidden melody. Second movement, hidden harmonies that change, but everyone in the group interprets the harmonies in different ways and with their own rhythms. Third movement is an exploration of that ultra-concrete programming style that I was talking about at the workshop a couple of days ago, where myself and the members of the laptop orchestra embedded in the audience know a scale, a mode that they're supposed to explore, and they have the idea of coming from the stratosphere, from the top of the spectrum down to the bottom of the spectrum over some period of time, and that's it. That's the whole thing. And we do it together and make music. That was really beautiful in the Birmingham space, because it's a dome, really, really tall dome with multiple planes of speakers all the way up, and a ring of tweeters at the top that you can address. So if you do these things that sort of start in the stratosphere, they have this really, really clear physical manifestation.
That's nice. Yeah.
A spatial manifestation in the space. And the final movement is Passacaglia, just like the final movement of the Brahms symphony. But one of the conceits of it is that it's a Passacaglia with a very fixed rhythm, so I can do all these tricks with delay lines on the voice to build up a kind of big choral climax to the piece. And in that one, I'm doing in that last movement, I do different types of live coding programming, but basically it's grooves. Using pattern programming to create beats. So I think as you go, you were asking like, I sort of went on that long description because you were asking about this hidden stuff and what the audience sees. I don't know that. The audience doesn't see the hidden stuff, but I think that they do see and follow the layers that they hear. Anyway.
Well, it's interesting in that context. You're also performing with acoustic musicians as well.
Yeah.
So when you're doing it telematically, are you streaming video of the acoustic musicians performing?
Yes.
Yeah. So people can see there's a visual element to people who are actually performing acoustically,
right,
as well as the screen for the code.
Yeah.
But one of the things I always think about coding, so this is a little bit more of a stepping back a second, thinking, how do we create, when we create the tools that we're using to perform with, or create the tools we're using for our creative practice, the way the form that the tools take really influences the way that we can use them, the way that they influence us to perform, right? So my sort of, my sort of like really simplest possible idea of this is if you're live coding, you create a function that you can call with one letter, you're more likely to call that function than a function that you have to call with 20 letters. Just that act of being able to easily access the name of a function or set the parameters, maybe that would affect how the course of the performance would the form that the course of the performance would take. But then you step back from that and you say, well, how about when you're coding a live coding language, you're creating the language, how do you structure in such a way to try to make what's going on understandable to people who are watching it, as well as something that you as a performer can interact with? Because those are two very different perspectives.
Right. Yeah, I think both of those things are considerations. There's kind of two different dimensions there that you have to play with. I often will use somewhat long-ish names for things in the things that I prepare in advance, and I think that does reflect a lot of desire for the code to be as theatrically salient as possible for the audience. I'm trying to think if I've done anything with... The only things I tend to do with sort of the single letter names are just sort of temporary things, I mean, but that's kind of a mainstream programming thing in a way too, right? Like, it's sort of common mainstream programming wisdom to use single letter variables only for things that are extremely temporary, extremely local in their scope, right? So if we make a pattern in Super Collider and we're playing with it for a while, maybe we call the pattern X because we know that in 5 minutes we're going to stop playing that pattern and we're going to be on to something else. So X is just kind of a temporary placeholder. But for other things, it's really fun to use descriptive names. And actually, it's maybe one thing I can say is that it's really fun and I think really powerful to use names not only to make the code comprehensible to the audience, but to make it meaningful to the audience. So the names can be jokes, they can be, or they can be deliberately mysterious or deliberately, obfuscated or they also can be improvised since in the end that they're arbitrary. And I think that when you do this kind of play with the names of variables or functions, the names of some other temporary construction in the code, you're accomplishing more than just telling the computer what to do. You're really calling attention to the way that code is always something that's meant for communicating with humans as well. And perhaps also you're exercising some originary capacity of human beings for naming things, which has a kind of like theological or philosophical component to it. I don't quite remember all the details, but I remember reading some Walter Benjamin essays where he talks about the significance of the human act of naming things. Which if you've ever named a child, is something that you feel like you're picking this name out of nothing, and it's going to stay with this thing for some period of time, and it's going to have this kind of like unpredictable influence on the fate, of that being over time. And it's just something that you do with kind of like absolute power, basically. Like maybe it's the only thing that we do with absolute power, as human beings, is to name things. And I think when, code kind of gets at that, and code and performance especially.
It's funny, I remember thinking about it as an instrument designer. He's like, naming instruments is kind of the same thing. You create something, even a composition is the same way.
Yeah.
Right? You write a composition, frequently you don't necessarily have a name for it at the top, and then you have to name it, and it changes the entire perception of whatever it is that you name.
Yeah.
So this whole thing about you'll go to a concert where there'll be 10 pieces, and they're all named, obviously, programmatically, just like the date that they were written or something like that.
Right.
It gives you so much less of a frame with which to view the work, which some people like, and some people choose to use the naming as another way of contextualizing what they're working on. So it's nice.
Yeah, and actually thinking about it a little bit more, it's one of the things that's really distinctive about code work, and especially code work in performance, is that you're not just naming it once, as with a composition, as a traditional composition. You're constantly engaged in this act of naming, right? Naming things. And I suppose that's it's also, I think this is something I think about a lot, that it's possible to forget how strange code and software is, and it's possible to forget how it hasn't even always been the way that computing has been organized. Like some of the earliest electrical computers were programmed in, if you were to watch someone doing it, you would think that they were doing modular synthesis, because the programming, or what we would call the programming, the specification of the algorithm was done by sticking a cable in a jack somewhere and connecting it to some other jack somewhere. It looks like modular synthesis. And in that circumstance, right, naming seems to me like it has a smaller role. But in, sort of fast forwarding to the present time, like, it's like code has become this like constant activity of naming and recognizing names, and
because it's like readability, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what happened. That's why they forward, so that you could read it, wasn't just a bunch of ones and zeros or whatever. So actually inherent in the type of programming you're doing is the point to make it readable and understandable.
Yeah. I think the naming thing, though, too, and I think we've only just started to explore this. When a live coding artist starts performing and they make a funny name for a variable and then play with it or something like that, it hints at a broader possibility too, the possibility of sort of creating new and esoteric languages. And live coding musical languages have always had a kind of flavor of that in them, but there's so much more that could be done to create esoteric, unique, locally meaningful languages.
Oh, I had a question. So this is like, no, we're just kind of jumping around.
Yeah, it's fine.
But because I use Super Collider a bit too, I've learned it, and I've totally blown up Super Collider and like messed it up. So like you were saying, like Scott Wilson was talking to you backstage, and then you used that right afterwards. I would be so scared that I was going to totally ruin everything and have to restart, Super Collider. Like, is that something you practice, or are there ways to make it so that doesn't happen?
I did try it once.
Okay.
In about a minute.
Right. But is that part of the excitement too? That seems like improvisation. I mean, at some point, like, you're always kind of nervous when you improvise, but it's like, if you've done it enough, you kind of get rid of that fear, and you're kind of more confident in yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is that it depends a little bit on the circumstances. So, like, the example I was talking about, it's in that first movement of the Symphonia, and all I'm doing in that is redefining the synthesizer. So it's a very small, circumscribed part of the larger synthesis system. And I don't think I can remember ever crashing Super Collider with a bad synthesis definition.
Okay.
I'm sure it's possible. You know? We should set it as a challenge on the Super Collider list. How easily can you make a synthesizer that will crash Super Collider? And people will come back with 10 answers within the hour. But I don't think I've ever accidentally done it. So I think that, you know, the worst that would happen would be I'd make a synthesizer that makes no sound, and the previous definitions of the synthesizer, you know, their envelopes would taper off, and if I didn't fix it in time, there'd maybe be a little breath in the music or something like that while I fixed it. And if I was really panicky about, oh dear, I went down the wrong path,
Right.
let's back up. You know, because I'm making lots of changes, lots of small changes to the code and reevaluating continuously, all I would have to do would be to just undo what I had just done.
Right, just go back.
And go back, you know? And so I think, you know, I instinctively have those strategies for sure. That said, I mean, I remember I actually did make a mistake with it in performance. I'm sure at least a few people in the audience caught it. It didn't make any, you know, it didn't make any loud, nasty sounds or anything like that. But I was doing this thing where in the first definition of the synthesizer, it starts out as just a kind of sine tone with a simple envelope, and then it gradually spreads around the speaker array that I had, and I was doing those spreads randomly, and I was managing the selection of random speakers, quote unquote, manually by specifying a range of indices from 0 to n-1 basically, and I was kind of like as I was expanding, I was forgetting that. And I think if someone was really following what I was trying to do, they would have realized that I was forgetting to update this, and so it was staying compact in this certain part of the room instead of spreading out. And then there was this moment where I went, oh, and sort of updated the index, and all of a sudden everything kind of like, you know, filters out around the room. But I think if you weren't following it really closely, you probably wouldn't have known that something was up. And if you were following it closely, you probably would have known that something was up. We have those kind of moments all the time in live coding, though, especially in the roulette, like where we're taking turns. You have a group and you're taking turns. There are these moments where you're like, I think I know what that person is doing, and I don't think they're doing it right.
Right.
And it creates this enormously interesting creative tension, because as long as the system doesn't blow up, the fact that the realization and the intention don't exactly match isn't really a liability. It's actually kind of like an asset, because then in a subsequent move in the game, whether by a soloist or whether by another, you know, person in a group, they have this enormous tension that they're responding to. Like, you know, let's say it's a roulette and you're taking turns, and you can see that someone was trying to do something and it didn't quite work. So now you come in and you're not just responding to the state of the code, and you're not just responding to the state of the machine, you're responding to this kind of like half-fulfilled intention there, you know? Do you, quote-unquote, fix it? Do you fix it in a way that takes it in another direction? You know, do you remove it? There are all these decisions, right?
It's like an open live forum. That's what I think of. It's like, oh, I don't know how to make this work. I thought it would work. And you're like, oh, I know how to make it work.
Right.
And you're right.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny, that makes me think about, well, on the one hand, you know, when you're performing, like for the example you gave, I mean, just based on sort of what my understanding of what you just said, you could imagine that maybe you intended to keep things really localized for a long time, and then at a certain point you let it distribute. I can imagine when that happened, it must have actually been quite a nice musical effect.
Sure.
Right? Which is, so it becomes one of these tensions between intentionality and what actually happens.
Yeah.
Sort of trying to second guess what people are trying to do. But then the other time, stepping back from that, if you're in a chamber ensemble, for example, like an improvising chamber ensemble, you know, and you see somebody try to execute something and fail, right? And the idea that you could then you could go back and you could fix that somehow, or execute what they failed to do successfully, and that, I think there's a different political kind of struggle there. I think that might be even a little bit insulting or problematic, whereas in the code world, maybe it doesn't feel like that, or, you know, maybe you see that you're just implementing it differently.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we started talking here, you were asking me about my feelings now as someone who was trained in composition about working with traditional ensembles, and and so I have all of the greatest respect for the musicians of the world as individual musicians, but I do actually find a lot of the ensemble situations that people are in stifling because of their emphasis on correctness. And I think that in the live coding context, often there isn't that emphasis on correctness. And it's sort of paradoxical in a way, right? You have this machine that is literally validating your syntax and will sort of spit ugly error messages at you if you get it wrong. And maybe perhaps to compensate for that, there's been this often a very improvisatory aesthetic and an embrace of, a certain kind of unpredictability and certainly an embrace of error and its productive effects on creativity. I think I've arrived at a point where I'm really profoundly disinterested in setting up situations where people can be right or wrong. And, for me that creates a real problem with the sort of traditional composition situation of the score that gets faithfully executed by the performers. And so for the Symphonia that we've been talking about, one of the things I said to all the people I was working with is, this is basically a set of ideas. If you want to do something different, go ahead. We're making music together. There is no such thing as a correct rendition of this piece. Doesn't mean that it's completely improvised either, but there's no such thing as a correct rendition of this piece. It's a kind of framework for music making. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong or right about performing it. There's no special points. No special karmic points that come for doing this thing correctly, just like there are no special points that come for doing anything else correctly. As I get older, I'm more and more concerned about this thing about validation and correction. I feel like maybe the regime of checking that things are correct and that texts match is, while obviously has a certain technical necessity within computing systems, is maybe not the best thing for human interests.
Well, it's funny. People usually can't see the score either. The audience can't see the score, so what matters really is the music, right? In the end, and I guess that's what happens with coding too. You could be like, "That's a really bad way to do that," but well, it made a sound and it sounds interesting. It's kind of, I guess, in the same vein,
right?
Yeah, certainly. Have some friends who, when they code, I'm always just shocked at sort of the way that they approach doing it, and they use values that are so orders of magnitude beyond what I would consider to be appropriate, and yet really cool things come out of it.
Right.
So it's good to sort of not box yourself in by what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
For sure. I do think it's interesting, this idea of composing and improvising, and I frequently think of myself as composing for improvising. You're composing to set up a scenario in which people can make music together, and of course the thing you really hope people do is live in the moment, and really sort of respond in the way that feels appropriate to them, whatever that means, at that time. But at the same time, there is an expectation that they're going to follow certain guidelines, if not rules. The thing I always come back to and think about this issue is free improvisation, right? Free improvisation meaning, originally, when people first started improvising in that sort of style, felt like a liberation from this idea of imposed genre, imposed style, all that. But at the same time, this, relatively quickly, really, it becomes people started to have a style, a free improvisation style that you had to stay within, right? So how quickly we sort of try to create boundaries within which to perform, and how challenging it can be sometimes to get outside those or expand them. And maybe it's just a constant process of keeping an open mind and really exploring and being aware of this tendency.
Sure. Yeah, it seems like it takes it seems like it takes some structure to be able to preserve some freedom.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stravinsky's famous quote,
right?
Said the tyranny of absolute freedom.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's another angle on this too, and I'm aware of this in proposing live coding compositions, which I think really is seen as slightly anachronistic sometimes. And I really came to it through the experience of directing a laptop orchestra that had people from really diverse backgrounds. Because in that specific setting, the live coding composition where you have, really somewhat more structure, somewhat more prior expectation about what's going to happen than is normal in a lot of live coding contexts. In that specific setting of the laptop orchestra, where you're getting people who are mixed up with different ranges of experience, different backgrounds, some people who have maybe just joined the orchestra that week, and others who've been in it for 2 or 3 years. The live coding composition can be something that unifies the group and provides a kind of flow experience for everyone. It provides an experience of sort of sufficient but not excessive challenge for everyone, because for the people who've just joined, the composition gives them very clear targets of what they need to do. While for those who've been in the group for some time or have more experience, perhaps the composition is specified in such a way that they're free to, add detail and nuance to it. I did a bunch of these over the years for laptop orchestras, and I think probably the one that typified this kind of idea the most was a piece actually done with Shawn Mativetsky called 5 Functions that's on the Cybernetic Orchestra's second album. And it was created in Chuck, and what is provided to the members of the orchestra is just a single Chuck file, and what the Chuck file contains is a bunch of functions, and what each of the functions do is just make a note with a kind of predefined synthesizer graph of some sort, predefined timbre. And then it also contains some instructions in the comments about the form of the piece. And you can play the piece just by uncommenting some calls to those functions at the top and changing a few of the parameters in accordance with the instructions. So, this is what I call the ultra-concrete style, right? Mm-hmm. It's very easy to get into that. Mm-hmm. Like, as long as you can type and follow instructions, and react a bit to what's going on around you, you can do that part of it. But then the instructions also say that you're free to redefine these functions, within the limits of your inclination and ability. And my experience has been that when you work with a laptop orchestra with that they do that. That, the people who want more, who want to do more, they go in and they change that, and they make the instrument their own in a way that responds to what they already heard from the default, but which, adds some personal twist to it. Mm-hmm. And that when you get a bunch of people doing this all together in a room, and they're spatially distributed, you get this kind of like extra heterophony. It's not just the heterophony of people doing things at slightly different times with slightly different parameters, but also with, their own synthesis ideas sort of added on top of it. But it's still recognizable as the piece in some level. So, I intend to do more of those, I guess. And this, the symphony that I'm just doing, which is not really a laptop orchestra piece, but has a laptop orchestra as part of it, that has, taken those ideas further still. And I guess it's the first time that I've applied that idea to myself as a live coding soloist too, creating a piece where there's a system that kind of provides some structure that it fires at me, and that I have to kind of work within, but where I don't have the responsibility to, provide absolutely everything, which can get overwhelming. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's nice to take it easy sometimes, too. That's the thing.
That's one of the things I
nice
like
to
about
take it
performing
easy.
in ensembles.
Yeah.
Is you don't have that pressure
Sure.
of writing all the material.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another way of removing that pressure is to automate systems.
Right.
So, playing along with the band in the box, for example,
Yeah.
is a terrible example. But one possible way of doing that, or playing with algorithmic systems.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads me into thinking about, you talk a lot about patterns, and you also talk a lot, or have mentioned a couple of times this idea of an ultra-concrete approach to performing.
Yeah.
So how different is, the ultra-concrete, from sort of my understanding we're talking about, it seems like you're thinking about going in there and changing sort of one event at a time, manually, right? So that's almost
Sure.
more of a traditional music performance mode, where you're responsible for everything happening in real time, as opposed to creating patterns where essentially you're creating algorithms that sort of persist over time.
Yeah.
Right. Does that sound like a fair characterization?
Sure, yeah. I mean, with the caveat that I think that the ultra-concrete style can become sort of liminally algorithmic, because you can do it in a way where you're triggering a single event, but you can also do it in a way where you're triggering some very small, very local cluster of events. You're doing some kind of harmonic arithmetic or what have you. So I think it's just on the edge of being an algorithm.
And it's funny because it actually reminds me back yesterday when you gave your presentation on the CIRMMT, you mentioned that when you are changing parameters in a pattern, for example, you get this issue of you change the parameter, you execute the function. When do you really want it to change? And this idea of there being an old versus a new function of the same function, and sort of keeping an awareness of a musical structure and embedding that within the system.
Yeah.
Which is certainly something that you don't always see in algorithmic music at all, first of all, right? And it's just kind of an interesting point for me.
Well, it's just the way I think that maybe Super Collider, that when they built those functionalities into it, they thought about it, like the quantization thing, like the beat thing. Like I remember when I learned about that, I was like, oh wow, this is great. So you can actually do like, because I learned Super Collider, it was just all this like no rhythm, just kind of amorphous stuff. And then I was like, oh, you can actually do like DJ stuff with this.
Right.
And maybe I would do music more because that it afforded, it let me do that.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on the system. Maybe are you using two,
There's you just speaking about the beat capacities of Super Collider, makes me think of this awesome Mexican Super Collider group, Miko Rex. Who've released an album, and they've got a second album coming out soon. And I think most, if not all, of the sound is managed through Super Collider, produced through Super Collider. And they sing as well. They have lyrics and all this. And in live performance, they do these really amazing live shows where they've got these homemade controllers hooked up to Super Collider. And they're basically game controllers, joysticks and stuff like that. But they've taken them out of their original packaging and just repackaged them in cardboard boxes and stuff like that, which apparently makes it easy to travel and easy to replace things if they get broken too. They just stick the electronics in a new box, cut a new hole, hook it up to Super Collider. But yeah, it's something I recommend to everyone because Miko Rex are amazing.
And so then they're taking the controls from the joystick to the gaming controllers and assigning them to create functions in Super Collider, or just
and also doing triggers and things like that for when sections of songs should move on. And
it's funny because that's in a way that's so one of the things about Super Collider and live coding languages in general, right, is I think this idea that on some level you're accessing relatively low level parameters, right, and you're not creating a user interface that has limits. The user interface theoretically doesn't have a bound, right? But of course, if you're going to map a controller to it, especially something like a joystick controller or a set of buttons, you have to create bounds for what those things can execute. That's always seemed like a really big difference for live coding. Not that live coding doesn't have bounds already, because you're working with a pre-configured group of algorithms that are behind the scenes. But at the same time, one of the aesthetics seems to be to try to overload things or make it so you can have real flexibility in terms of the way you pass parameters and the way you embed things in the code.
Yeah, it can be about that. I don't know, I mean, I think that there's a kind of multi-dimensional space that we're talking about here, where there's possibilities. One range of possibilities is around communicating textually with the audience And another range of possibilities is around using the code as a way to constantly be able to step outside of the box, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of specify structures at new, higher or lower levels of abstraction. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is an independent dimension or not, but it's definitely worthy of mention. There's also the idea of using the code not as a way to specify structures at arbitrary levels of abstraction, but as a way to explore a certain search space, right? The idea of live coding as something that facilitates not the production of results beyond a particular range, but the exploration of results within a certain range within a new way. Mm-hmm. And I think for me and a lot of people that's pretty fundamental. That part is also pretty fundamental to live coding. Okay. The fact that when you do it, you are exploring mm-hmm. what is possible, mm-hmm. whether within or without some standardized range. Mm-hmm. And maybe being surprised sometimes. When Shawn and I, this very long cat, when we performed at the International Conference on Live Coding in Leeds this past summer, the first international conference on live coding. By the way, the second international conference on live coding will take place here in Canada, McMaster, in October 2016, April 4th deadline for performance and paper proposals. When we were performing at the ICLC in Leeds last summer, there was I thought a really nice thing that happened at the end of our performance, which was that I made a mistake with some what I'll call unprotected code. So, what I mean by protected is that it's sometimes nice to make your synthesizers in such a way that if you give them a value that's beyond a safe range, mm-hmm. things don't blow up. Well, apparently I hadn't done that with some of these synths. And I gave a really, really high MIDI note number to a synth that we're using in performance by mistake. So it gets translated into some blistering frequency, and we hear this melody just go whoosh, up to this really burning high frequency. And I realize my mistake and I take it down. And then instinctively I do the classic jazz thing of repeating a mistake. Like the only way of covering for this is to do it again. Mm-hmm. So I go up to another frequency and I pick a different one because hey, variety is great, right? So up it goes again, and a third time and a fourth time. But on the fourth time, I pick a fourth different frequency, and everything goes quiet. Like I do something that just whoops. Oh, I do something that just shuts everything down, mm-hmm. And that becomes like the trigger for the end of the piece. So and you get this kind of thud or thump as things shut down. So it's a total glitch, and it's like a mistake on top of a mistake. Right. And I still don't really know what happened, but that mistake, or that mistake on top of the mistake, I think it ended up being a really nice musical moment that came at the right time. Mm-hmm. Did it have mistakes are great in live coding? Mm-hmm. Mistakes are great. Mistakes are great, and I've really stopped worrying about them. If I have something that is not evaluating a performance, I won't hesitate to just expand the post window and quickly peer through the code to figure out what I'm doing, that was wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that embracing those mistakes, including just basic syntax mistakes where things don't compile or don't get interpreted, it is actually one of the other powerful things about live coding in terms of computational literacy, in terms of encouraging people to be engaged with code. Because when you do that, when you make a mistake in public and, everything is still okay, and you show people that you're making mistakes and that it's normal, I think that you're also showing people who are less experienced with these things mm-hmm. that that's normal. And it's okay, that hacking, working with computers, programming doesn't have to be this kind of Olympic sport that, is only reserved for, the Neo-style hackers who can see, see directly into the matrix.
Right.
Those people don't exist, actually. What does exist is sort of real people that experience cognitive loads and, experience moments of clarity and probably many more moments of confusion, confusion and panic. So I think it's important to put that on stage, and
And I think that's a good point. I think I just thought about this. Like when you're actually coding, you're getting to see how people are thinking, right? You're typing out code, and you're like, oh, I think he's trying to do this, but no sounds have been made. Nothing has changed. I mean, where else can you get that?
Right.
You can't do that in music. Say, oh, he's gonna wait to do this. But you can see that happening in live code, like, oh, he just made this function, but he didn't use it yet.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see when he uses that function. You know what I mean? You have all these setups and all these things that can happen, I guess, too.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting, too. So you can learn from people in the same light. Be like, oh, that's a cool way he wrote that function. Or it's a cool way he did that.
Yeah.
Without making sound ever.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we first made the extramuros software for live coding collaboration on the internet. And the way it came about was that we had gotten this grant to do networked live coding, and so we were officially on this project, and we had gotten this performance accepted somewhere, and we were trying out different ways of doing it, and it was getting closer and closer and closer and closer to the accepted performance. And so I hacked together this thing, in a day, basically, using some libraries that were already out there that would let us do it on the web and then pipe the code into whatever rendering agent we chose. And so one of the first times using it was a couple years ago now. We were going to use it with Tidal for this first performance, and so we had this rehearsal where it was just myself and Alex McLean, the creator of Tidal. And we were, at first we were testing, making sure that the software was working, and then we were jamming a little bit. And I hadn't really used Tidal very much at that point. I mean, we'd said we were going to do the performance in Tidal, but, I hadn't really done it yet. That was all kind of in theory, and now this performance is coming up, and now I was playing with Alex through this extramuros interface. And, I learned more in that half hour of rehearsal, than I had learned in many other contexts to that point about Tidal, just by playing with someone who was an expert, seeing their code right next to mine, and being able to kind of not copy the code, actually, because anyone who's ever sort of taught programming can tell you copying code is disastrous, both for learning and for functionality, right? Because it tends to expose interfaces that are unpredictable on some level, right? What you get when you code alongside someone in a collaborative interface is really that kind of like physical sense, surrogate physical sense, of the act of programming, because you're not just seeing the code, you're seeing the code as it develops, right?
Just so it seems like there's so many parallels between music and coding too. I mean, people think about it as different things too, but I mean, as you're learning from, I don't know, like learning tabla or learning percussion or anything, I'm a percussionist, but I mean, you can watch them, you can try to copy them, but you can't take their hand off, and do it. You have to try to figure out yourself. Like, it's in the same way with coding. It's like, okay, well, I'll try to do this myself and see how far I can get without directly copying it,
Yeah, one of my conceits that I'm sort of hoping one day to be able to investigate more closely is actually the idea that music and code, like algorithmic programming, are more fundamentally related than may seem at first blush. And I'm thinking of things like the fact that, when Ada Lovelace writes some of the first things that are written about the possibilities of programming in the 19th century, she specifically talks about music, the possibility of making programs to make music. And in the 1950s, when some of the first big public electrical computers were unveiled to the public, often the first demonstrations were of them sort of bleeping out sounds of some sort that had been, algorithmically generated. And there's the connection between what modular synthesis looks like to us now and the way that some of the other early electrical computers were programmed.
Mm-hmm.
I think music has actually been really, for a long, long time, it's been kind of like secretly bound up with algorithmic culture, patterns, code, and that our present time is maybe just a time where this relationship is becoming less secret and is becoming more something that's celebrated in the open.
Great. Well, it's 11, so I guess we could wrap up. So
Sure.
you can
Yeah.
get
Well,
your...
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for talking. That was
fun.
pretty interesting.